that in case you guys go to sleep, I will take only half the responsibility. The rest would be the strength and the quality of the coffee that was served, or lack thereof, or lack thereof. So, but with that said, let me start with something that hopefully will get you awakened. This is a New York Times title. Sooner or later, your cousin's DNA is going to solve a murder. There was a cold case. 17 years, a couple killed, some DNA on the site, absolutely no idea who the murderer is. One day, one person had the brilliant idea of doing what they call genealogy search, using family tree forensics on a site where many people get themselves sequenced to know their ancestry. Now, what they found is one of the members on this site had to be at least a second cousin to the person whose DNA was unknown. Now, from here on, you can see how it gets better. You can start figuring out all possible second cousins in the family. You can co-localize to people who were in the vicinity living in Florida. Then you can figure out whose mobile phones could have been active in that region that day, and you found your murderer. So we live in amazing times. None of the cousins who had signed up for that ancestry site would have even thought about this particular application of what they were about to do. In fact, many people react to this story with great happiness, showing the potential of genomics. Many people raise the specter that today it was an unknown DNA for a murder, tomorrow it could be something else. Does this constitute a major violation of privacy? And if so, by whom? By your second cousin who chose to put up their DNA into a public domain so people could figure out ancestries for a good cause? Are they responsible for your breach of privacy? It's a really interesting question because in the world of genomics, what you say is mine is shared by your immediate blood family. When you consent to share it, you consent to share that information as well. At my former institute, the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology, we could see that a very debilitating type of disease, spinocerebellar ataxia, was seen in Agarwals. My last name is Agarwal, so I'm free to talk about these things. The question became, do we talk about it? Will Agarwals get stigmatized? Or is it good for the community so that every time an Agarwal comes with a difficulty in walking at rapid pace, the doctor will have an easy diagnosis to make? All these questions have been touched in the past for Ashkenazi Jews. People use Ashkenazi Jews as an example of inbred races. If you were to use a simple mathematical construct, length of identical segments of DNA on your father and mother chromosome and their distribution, you can calculate the degree of relatedness between your mother and father. If a normal person in America is about here, an Ashkenazi Jew is about here, at least 25% of major Indian subcommunities hit this roof of this auditorium. And mine is one of them. So, in the end, we did decide that this was worth knowing. Probably socio-economically, we cannot be called a weak community. So the likelihood of discrimination against Agarwals is kind of on the low side. But change this entire scenario to a weak minority community where discrimination is possible and the decision would have been far more complicated. So when we talk about sharing data, we must realize that this fourth wave of digital health, which is best imagined not as a digital way of delivering conventional health, it's not about using digital to deliver health in the way we see health today. It's about reimagining health at the convergence of the digital and the genomic revolutions. And when I say genomic here, I don't really mean only genomics. I mean every omic you can imagine. To me, the physiome is as interesting as everything else. And there are many people who would call the phenome as the most interesting thing. In fact, when people, and this is a paper I've taken from the 100th year issue of the New England Journal, in which they looked at a glimpse of the next 100 years in medicine. A point that probably would not be surprising to the people in this room. It's not about our imagination in creating very, very small devices collecting lots of things. The challenges will be in our ability to make sense of the data coming out of those devices. We are already at a point where you simply cannot summarize in the English language the output of an algorithm using even a well-known physiological signal like an ECG. You looked at a recent Nature Medicine paper, your ECG signals can predict your heart attack risk years down. It's got nothing to do with what we talk about as myocardial injury currents that we understand as physiology. Which effectively means that a doctor can no longer tell a patient why I say what I say. In fact, to be honest, as a slightly cynical statement, I think we're already quite well used to it. Many things where we tell them we understand why we say what we say, we possibly don't. Because even after all these years, we don't fully know how aspirin works. Because not every NSAID shares that characteristic. But that apart, the idea that we would not be able to explain what we do is difficult when we ask for AI explainability. And that word explainability at the core of many discussions, many of you would know it's unreal. We simply will never reach explainability for many things. In fact, we haven't historically. Then, we have this onset of ideas like the digital twin. The jet engines already had a digital twin. You can take a jet engine flying over the deserts of Arabia, over extremely frigid poles. Those engines will require servicing at a completely different rate compared to an engine flying over just continental Europe. Today, Porsche, the suspension, if any of you currently or in future will own it, comes with a digital twin of the suspension. Of course, every time I think of it, I always imagine that in Gurgaon, somebody will buy a Porsche, go over a massive speed bump, and the car will say, time to go back for servicing. That too will occur. But a much more effective use case that we must think about is a digital twin for children who will be sequenced at birth. Today, for a sick baby, whole genome sequencing has very high yield in figuring out things that could not have been figured out without sequencing. But many times, whether done for this reason or done for any other reason, you will find interesting stuff that is important, but you have no idea what to do with. And I'll give you the example of a BRCA mutation, a breast cancer gene mutation. Many of you know this mutation because Angelina Jolie had it, and she decided to get the breasts and the ovaries and uterus all removed. Let me explain to you why that is not as stupid as it sounds. The risk of a woman today developing breast cancer and suffering from it, if they do not die of an infection or a heart attack in their life, is approaching 20%. If you were to increase the odds with a mutant, which does 3 to 5 times the odds, this will be the expected life course for that person. So clearly it's worth knowing. Who are you going to tell? The baby? The parents? What are the parents going to do with the baby girl with the BRCA mutation? The doctor? The doctor might be out of practice by the time something needs to be done. In the end, no matter how you imagine the future, you have to imagine a future of a health twin. You have to imagine the future of a health twin where the AI knows and the patient, the doctors do not. You don't transfer the burden of knowledge because everything does not need to be known by a human being. But when there is time to act, the knowledge needs to come into the physical world. This future will come. So we have to completely reimagine how we think about data and the ethics of data. It's not just about consent. What exactly would you do? You'd walk to the parents and say, we have found something very important in the genome of your baby. Please give us consent to tell you or not. That's a transfer of responsibility. That's not a solution. So consent should never be seen as a way of transferring responsibility. The other important thing, and I'm borrowing a lot from things people have spoken about today, and I think Shinjini started it by saying you should also know what type of data you work with. This paper come up with bias. I think that was Sudeep Gupta who spoke about this paper. But let me tell you about this paper because it's important. Obermeyer was examining an algorithm used in America to predict who is going to become sick. Now, people say an insurance company is your best friend for health. They are more invested in your health than anybody else in this world. assuming they plan to pay. If they don't plan to pay, they're not your friend. But assuming they plan to pay, they want to find out as soon as you're going to get sicker so they can give you more care to prevent you from reaching the hospital. So this is the algorithm risk that algorithm used all over America used to do. On the y-axis, you have the number of active medical conditions. The darker line are black people, the yellowish line are white people, and you can see to get the same score, a black person needed to have more medical conditions. Why? Was the algorithm racist? Somebody was planning to discriminate against black people? Of course not. If the data is that a sick person is defined by a hospital admission and poor people are sicker before they get admitted, algorithm will simply adjust for it. Imagine ABDM data. Imagine India trying to build such algorithms with that data. Try to imagine how sick a poor person in India would have to be before a cancer admission has to be done. You simply cannot use data without an understanding of the framework in which the data is generated. But not using data is also not the solution. If you were to look at AI solutions in dermatology, they work brilliantly on white skin. Can you take an AI algorithm built on white skin and apply it to dark skins? No. Vitiligo is complete opposite, for example. If you were to look at genomics, 70% of all genome-wide association studies come from 3 countries. If you look at the greatest diversity in this world, genomic diversity, it's in Africa. They are 2% of the genomes. The next best diversity is probably India. I mean, people could disagree, but it's probably India. When my institute sequenced 1,000 whole genomes, we found 15 million new variants never catalogued before. When Africa sequenced about 400, they found about 10 million. These are the ranges of what is unknown. So I would like to submit an end to this first section, that the digital health ecosystem is grounded in users and their data. Not getting the data is bad. Wrongly getting the data is bad. Misusing the data is bad. Everything is bad. But we need to think about how to do better. So I used to chair this commission called the Governing Health Futures 2030. It was between the Lancet and the Financial Times. And we had a relatively large group of people, and while it is not obvious from looking at this picture, we had a very large number of young people whom we involved in this commission, because the idea was growing up in a digital world for a digitally native generation that will be seeing all these things from ground up. And what they think health means is very different from what old people think health means. You ask any group of older people, what does health mean? They will talk about diabetes, cancer, hypertension, heart attacks. I'll talk about COPD because I'm a lung doctor. Nobody else will talk about COPD anyway. But if you were to ask a group of young people, they will start with things like wellness, mental well-being, fitness. If it's in a room that is more open, they might say sexual health. If it's even more open, they might speak about identity. In an engaging discussion, you might find that having an identity online that is different from the one that they have in the real physical world is extremely important to people. In fact, your entire idea of what health and healthcare should mean if you talk to young people. Anyway, this is for those of you interested in this particular issue of the Lancet. But here are the 3 things that we came up with. One is all frameworks must be value-based, and you must talk about these things in terms of trust and solidarity. You cannot have solidarity without trust, and trust building is entirely different from passing laws. Number 2, we must recognize digital will become a determinant of health. If you recognize that digital will become a determinant of health, then you have to act on digital as if it were any other thing that you talk about for health. And the last part, the generation that will do it has different priorities from the current ones. Their attitudes towards data may be different from the current one. People share fitness data all the time. That is also personal. Any kind of imagination of progress in this area cannot be independent of what use is it for, what people it caters to, and their value systems. So this was, of course, address the role of digital technologies. We will speak today only of a governance architecture that fosters trust, and of course, governing health data to increase public value. We must recognize that health data has public value. Many things we do in this world are for public purposes, and we have to invest in many enablers to make this happen. So, what is solidarity? As to use this word many times. Before I go to solidarity, let me take the most common notion. My data belongs to me. It's my data. I must give a consent before the data can be used. What is the implicit in this? Why exactly does my data belong to me? The classical rules of ownership. Is it usable by somebody else at the same time? Can you exclude a non-paying person? So, if I have a flat, I live in it, nobody else can use it. I can put a lock on the door and prevent anybody from accessing it. The use, and if I were talking oil, it'll be burnt after I've used it. Nobody else can use that oil again. At least the flat can be used again. But data obeys none of these principles. In fact, if I were to go get my genome sequenced, I only had my genome and nobody else's genome in the world. What will I do with my genome? Nothing. In much of what we do in health, there is an implicit assumption. Other people's data will be used to make sense of my data. Therefore, it is not unreasonable to say that data used in ways that are unlikely to be harmful to the person whose source the data was should not be a matter of huge debate. And consent is a very interesting thing. We consent 100 times on our iPhones every day, or Androids for whoever uses Android. Every time an app comes that we want, within microseconds we probably click the button and say I consent. In fact, I can't even bother to look at the cookies half the time before I consent. The people who can give the lollipops will get consent very fast, while people who cannot will not get consent. If you were to build an equitable architecture, the small companies will never get consent, while the Googles will get the consent in the fastest way possible. And is it about consent? It's about informed consent. What does the word informed mean? Information given is correct, information understood is correct. How many informed consents can you think of complex medical issues that are truly informed consent, particularly for long-term implications of the type I discussed in the beginning? The reality is they aren't. In fact, more and more legal protection, and there's a very nice paper, I would encourage people to look at it. The crisis of consent may actually lead to weaker consent in data protection. You get so immune to clicking things that you just becomes weaker. Everybody forces you to click on something before you go to the web page. By the time it becomes almost a reflex, see the thing, click OK. So this is the type of things I've already discussed, so I won't speak more about it. But I will come to how can one have the concept of solidarity. The idea of solidarity is, first we all acknowledge there are risks. We don't pretend there are no risks. We don't pretend that taking your consent absolves us of all responsibility towards mitigating that risk. We simply think of the world on these two dimensions. And this is work by Barbara Peinsek, one of our commissioners, and she's working with us in a new center we have at Ashoka called Digital Transformation for Health. We know that digital transformation of health is going to occur anyway. We want it to be for health. So if you look in these two dimensions, high risk and high value, that's probably where genomic data would go. You have to speak about mitigation instruments. The simplest mitigation instrument is public policy. If there were free healthcare for all, people's concern about I will not get healthcare if I'm found to have a mutation goes away. If there is a policy that no insurer can block insurance based on medical information, problem goes away. If we understood that genomic data can never be de-identified, or it can be used in a variety of ways. In fact, I would tell you that even the meaning of the word de-identification is meaningless. If, let's say I find 100 people completely anonymized, I do not want to insure them. Every time a new person comes, I calculate a probability score of this person belonging to that group. I have never identified anybody. But based on the probability score, I can still discriminate against the person. The answer is in mitigation and policy. And there should be this, right? It's high risk and low public value. Just ban the use. Don't even allow consent. If there is no public value, maybe make it even that only after you pay money to people can people have some benefit sharing. I'm not giving you any answers to any of these. It's anyway written for you to read. And what is written is not necessarily correct. It is simply a matter of public thought and debate. And this is what we are not doing. I think I will not bother with this much too much. It's quite obvious it is high and high. Are mitigation strategies in place? Yes, thankfully. At least in genomic data, it's entirely possible to use it as much as you like without getting any identity at all by not making it downloadable. You can't get the entire sequence, but you can get a federated learning algorithm architecture because it's all interoperable. The way it is generated, interoperability is not an issue. And there are a variety of things. But even here, there is always some risk, right? I mean, you could think of very innovative ways of writing an algorithm and getting back a number that allows you to do something. But it's minimized. And of course, all these things, fairness, context, heterogeneity are critical in all this. But the basic point is intent. People with different intent and reasons for being able to access the data can have completely different barriers to access. If you want to access the UK Biobank data, they set up completely differential barriers. You as a company, you as an academic researcher, you as a contributor, all will face very different standards to be used. And these examples are around us. India will also eventually create a biobank. We should think of this. And again, this is always true. Wherever there are national laws, you have to follow them. It's not a matter of debate. So I'm going to not spend too much time on this. I know the time is about getting to be over. But what I would say is the most important thing is solidarity is about a collective commitment to carry costs. Knowing the costs will occur. That's all it really means. You could think of it in 100 different ways. What's typical is we do this anyway. We do this for people with whom we recognize sameness and similarity, right? We do it for family. What the idea is to do it at a scale is it doesn't become about your recognition. It simply becomes about a standard definition. And I really think the best example I can think of today for data accessibility, harm mitigation, participation is probably the UK Biobank. And now there will very soon be a biobank of biobanks. So that's going to be interesting. Where is general health data? There is no easy answer. Different types of data have different public value. Knowing how much money you paid for a given year based on who the person asking for the data is can have extremely different risks. So let me end by quickly coming to the Indian Digital Personal Data Framework. The Data Protection Board of India has been established. One important thing I would tell you is in the very beginning of this, it very clearly says fully de-identified data is not under this act. And also, this act only applies to automated processing. So read through it. It's kind of interesting. The problem will come in the further expansion of these words. What is the meaning of de-identified data? What are the standards the government will use to call something de-identified? In fact, even de-identified and anonymized are different words. So I think while it seems that yes, this frees us from responsibility, the better way to think is use this, but also use all the principles I talked about in approaching it. One very nice thing is that informed consent is emphasized with proper documentation of information and the consent. So both the information that you provided must be documented and the consent that you obtained. It can't be just the consent was obtained with a line saying I was informed. It also creates rights of individuals, right to information about personal data. I think this is a really interesting one. Right to correction and erasure of personal data. Right to grievance redressal and right to nominate someone to manage the data. All interesting things. The devil is always in the details as usual, but good start at least we have a policy. At least India has taken a massive step in creating a national digital health mission. I know that BMGF has been very, very instrumental in supporting the idea of ABDM. So we have a tremendous opportunity as a country, but we should discuss data a bit more and its governance beyond simply the letters of the act. And we should not look at the word de-identified doesn't apply as a license to do whatever we want. So thank you all. And as usual, Dilbert has very interesting insights on this world.
Thank you, Anurag. That was 5 minutes before time. Any questions? Yeah.
First of all, thanks to Ashoka for standing up for academic freedom. We all appreciate that.
Well, let's say plus minus anyway.
You mentioned about the apps. We have to read up about 7 pages of legal agreement and then sign. I mean, we do it. I mean, we don't. Nobody reads it. And I was thinking we need an AI solution to actually tell us what is the risk for me to sign that. So generally, what I'm coming to is when new AI solutions come, which is intended to help the doctor tell something to the patient, many times it is, if it is a definitive risk, I can easily explain to the patient, okay, you are getting bitten by a snake, you will die if you don't reach the hospital. Very clear. But when you are doing probabilistic modeling, since I work with cancer, it is very difficult to actually tell the patient, you have a 3 times risk of dying with this if you don't take this medicine in the next 1 year. So he'll ask me, what is the risk for me? I will tell him, I can't tell that. I can only tell the risk of 100 people like you. And I can tell you, and you interpret it. So probabilistic modeling, I feel we need more AI to actually solve the answers given to us by AI. So is it really helping the doctor? It's a challenge which I foresee in the future.
First, I fully agree with you. And in fact, if they were told that that 3 had a confidence interval of 1.01 to 9, they would react very, very differently. So my general point is perhaps we have gone overboard with too much information, which is non-actionable. So conversations should rotate around actionability and evidence. The fact that evidence does not apply to the individual should be very, very clear, and that different people can be different. And I honestly think AIs will help us manage evidence. So we talked today about multiple things, including AI in images. Just imagine AI in medical practice, and you are the best person to do it, perhaps, because cancer is so complicated. I can see a future where, given the context, AI can diagnose almost as well as humans, or better in many things. There was a beautiful study in the Lancet showing that on a chest X-ray, there are 124 features. In 117 out of 124, AI is better than the radiologist. And in 7 out of 124, it is equal to the radiologist, leading to the eventual certification that in X-ray read as normal by AI does not need to be read by a human being. But that's not a diagnosis, right? Diagnosis requires context. It's not finding. It is the clinical context of those findings. Let's assume AI gets there. The next part, therapeutics. There are so many different parts to it that as an oncologist you would realize if there was a drug that cost 10 times more but only increase the probability of benefit by 10%, you would take a look at the person in front of you and give advice. Decisions, particularly in an out-of-pocket society, not only as part of a national guideline, are very individualized. I don't see AI helping much except providing evidence side by side. So what we did at IGIB is we created a genome card. So people who get sequenced by us have this little card with a QR code. And the evidence keeps changing. I mean, we are possibly the only specialty in which you're already wrong by the time the paper stops printing. So at some point, if you were to scan that QR code using your phone, maybe a year down, it might give you a message saying, please go visit one of these people. When you go visit those people, all they get is the evidence for what has been found for the visit. It is for the doctor to look at the evidence, choose what to communicate based on the overall circumstances of the patient. And my feeling is a right imagination of health futures will correctly balance what we as human beings are truly good at and what we think we are good at but probably are not. I think one more question before, and I might screw up terribly on this one. I can see it's going to be a tough one.
Yeah, please. I said yes. One mic here.
I think it's interesting. Science fiction has foreshadowed a lot of different things, right? Let's say Matrix on the digital side, but Gattaca. Have you ever any of you
Yes,
seen the
of
movie
course,
Gattaca?
of
Right.
course.
So there, the idea is in the in the zygote itself, or whatever the egg itself, or possibly the sperm, you edit out what you think are offending characteristics, and it's all about that. So we don't know where this future is going to go. I was curious whether you think microbiome also is a significant determining factor, or
Oh,
is it
absolutely.
or genome is the main thing that determines the future? And how would an insurance company, for example, if they relied only on the genome, whether maybe in some cases the genome is very predictive, but other cases maybe the microbiome and other
So
factors.
clearly, the microbiome is a massive constituent of health. Even all the way down to gut-brain axis is increasingly clear it's not about gut health. Regarding the Ithaka movie and removing what we consider bad, there is one huge thing we must remember. I'm a fan of Nicholas Taleb's books. I mean, the Black Swan started it, but you might have read the Anti-Fragility, right? The idea is that diversity is critical to be preserved. There is tremendous disagreement within our community on what is to be done with deleterious mutations, which would not be significantly changing of life. Do you try to eradicate them? What if you were to find that they actually had some useful function? So interfere less has been the current consensus. Of course, when you do zygote selection between multiple zygotes of a person in whose family a genetic disorder is running, this is relatively obvious. But otherwise, there is too much that is simply unknown with variable penetrance, and we don't necessarily even know what super healthy is. One very interesting thing I will say in the context of India for those who want to do research in this area, we are the best place to find good genes. Good genes are best found in adversity. The best drug recently for cholesterol, PCSK9, was found by Helen Hobbs by looking at black people living in Texas with low cholesterol. Right? She figured if they have low cholesterol in that diet, in that state, something is good. She found a mutation in a particular gene. Antibody has now been created, small molecules, in less than a decade. If you can't take a statin, the best drug that you can take. If you were to survey 10,000 Indian miners and find somebody who after 15 years of mining still has good lungs, you're onto something. So I think we live sometimes in the land of adversity, and if we focus on looking at super healthy people despite the adversity, we have great opportunity, and then will come the ethics. Can you introduce those things? In chimpanzees, we can introduce a PCSK9 knockdown, and for years the cholesterol will stay low and the atherosclerotic disease does not develop. But ethical issues.
Okay. Thanks, Anurag, for your insights. So just wait a second.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'll welcome Professor Karthik Raman from IIT Madras to present the momentum.
Thank you.